Well, welcome everyone. I'm really excited. Welcome folks from the Presbytery of Central New Jersey, but we also have people north, south, east, and west of us. So I'm really glad that you all are here with us for this first learning opportunity of the spring, COVID-19 vaccines and variants, oh my. This is the first of a series of educational gatherings called Courageous Spaces. So why courageous, you may be wondering? Because when we learn something new, we stretch and grow. And so we enter these learning spaces with a posture of courage and openness, trusting that we won't be the same when we leave. So visit the Presbytery website, centralnjpresbytery.org, for more information about future workshops. So I'm excited to welcome Lisa Allgood as our presenter for this evening. She is a trained immunocytochemist. See, I practiced that, Lisa.
Well done.
You know, I had to say it twice because I was so excited. And a graduate of the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey. Lisa spent 36 years as an executive in the pharmaceutical industry, and she is now a commission ruling elder currently serving as Executive Presbyter for the Presbytery of Cincinnati. Lisa is secretary of the board of directors for Synapis, a Christian nonprofit based in Kenya, serving entrepreneurs in 10 countries on 2 continents, training and equipping them to build their businesses and thereby breaking the cycle of poverty in a Christian ethical framework, and also serves on the board of Women Helping Women, working on breaking the cycle of gender-based violence. Lisa has 2 daughters, one completing her doctorate in clinical psychology at Xavier University, and one living in North Carolina, who's married and teaches high school chemistry and environmental science. Travel and photography are her favorite hobbies when she's not running endless meetings and doing churchy things. So Lisa, welcome back to New Jersey in our virtual space here. We're so grateful that you're here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yeah, for those that didn't catch the first part of it, I was born and raised in the New York City, New Jersey area. My parents are still in Bergen County, where I went to high school. I'm a Rutgers College before it was subsumed into the big university, proud graduate. I worked at Merck Sharp Dome Pharmaceuticals when their headquarters was in Rahway. My grandparents were in Forked River. So I was actually in the choir at Trinity Presbyterian Church for a little while, went to Flemington Presbyterian Church, Norwood Presbyterian Church, Forked River Presbyterian Church. So I know your territory, and it's sort of fun to be here with you guys. And yes, I am God's sense of humor on display. Let's take a twice retired immunologist and make her executive presbyter in the middle of a global pandemic. Let's do that. Let's see how that goes. So it's a long story about how I got here, but I've been here now for 2.5 years. Working with the Presbytery, it has been a joy and a blessing, even in the midst of the pandemic. So we're going to talk a little bit about the virus, the biology of the virus. We're going to talk about what it does in the body, which will set you up to understand why some of the suggestions that we have for church kinds of things are there. We'll talk about the variants that are emerging. We'll talk about the vaccines. I'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then I'm just going to open it up for questions. So if I go too fast or you've got a question during, please, you can put it in the chat or save it to the end, either way. So COVID-19 is one of 7 different kinds of coronaviruses that the human body has encountered. 4 of them cause the common cold. They're around, they're minor, no big deal. 2 of them caused what I will call minor pandemics. One was SARS out of Singapore back in 2004. The other one is MERS out of the Middle East back in 2012. Both of those are far less infectious than COVID-19, but far more fatal. And that's why they didn't spread very far. So the coronavirus is called the coronavirus because it's actually a wimpy thing. It's a sack of fat that has protein spikes on the outside. You've all seen the pictures, and it has a single strand of messenger RNA in there. That's the genetic code that codes for the virus. Those protein spikes attach to cells in your nasal passages. This is an aerosolized virus. It injects the mRNA into the cell. That mRNA takes over the cellular mechanism, makes a ton more virus, bursts the cell open, and then the infection continues. That's what a virus does. This virus is not very, doesn't last very long on surfaces. Originally, we said it was terrible and you had to clean everything. It's been shown to last about 3 to 4 days on an impermeable surface, like a doorknob or a light switch or the back of a pew, and 1 to 2 days on a permeable surface, like a piece of paper. But the fact that it's a sack of fat is why you're told to wash your hands for 20 seconds with soap and hot water, because that disrupts it and completely eliminates the virus. The virus itself is not alive, and that's part of what a virus is. But one of the key things about this virus is that we actually completed the genetic sequence for this virus last January 11th of 2020. It was almost immediate as soon as we knew about it. And that's part of the reason why the vaccines that we've got now came so quickly, because we knew the genetic code almost immediately. COVID-19 is a highly infectious virus. It spreads very quickly. It's at least 3 times more infectious than any other respiratory virus. And the variants that have emerged are even more infectious than that. The chances of you being exposed to the virus or catching the virus is really 2 factors: how long you've been exposed to the virus and how much virus you've been exposed to. This is so infectious that the maximum chance of you getting infected occurs after only 15 minutes. That's how infectious this virus is. So if you think about that in terms of a church service, even if you cut your church service in half and you're only meeting together for 30 minutes, you've already hit your maximum exposure halfway into your service. The infection rate in the US is about 15 times that of the rest of the world, and the world is now spiking for the 4th time. Even right now, the US does not have this under control. All 50 states are experiencing variants. The UK variant is now the predominant virus circulating in the United States, and they're all beginning to spike or at least plateauing. So they're no longer going down. We are now at about 1 in 10 people infected in the United States. And if this keeps going, we'll probably be at maybe 1 in 8 by the time this is done. Certain subcenters, including New Jersey and New York, LA, and Texas, and Florida, are at about 1 in 5. So you've got some hot spots, and New Jersey right now is definitely a hot spot. This is infecting every country. There is no country that is exempt from this. But the virus is actually pretty insidious, and it's insidious for a couple of different reasons. 40% of those who are actually infected and shedding virus, so are infecting other people, have absolutely no symptoms. They're completely asymptomatic. So without a mask, you don't necessarily know if you're sitting across from someone who may be exposing you to the virus. For those who are infected and will go on to develop symptoms, they can be completely asymptomatic for about 8 days up until they experience symptoms. So again, without a mask, you could be sitting across from somebody who will become symptomatic, but isn't yet, and is still exposing you to the virus. One of the other insidious things is back in August of last year, before the schools were deciding whether to go back or not, 3 centers in the United States did a study in ages 4 to 17. And it was shown that children in that age range have up to 25 times more virus in their nasal passages than hospitalized adults. So children are a very significant vector of community spread for this virus, and always have been. And that's important when we go back to talk about herd immunity and vaccinations. Right now, we are showing demonstrated cases of reinfection after vaccination. There have been demonstrated cases of reinfection even before vaccination. Right now, globally, the World Health Organization reports more than 144 million confirmed cases of COVID, with almost, I forget what the stat is, sorry, 3.1 million reported deaths. In the United States, we have more than 32 million confirmed cases and more than 575,000 deaths. That's more than all of the US deaths from World War II, Vietnam, and Korea combined. We have the highest per capita death rate in the world. The US alone accounts for 20% of all global deaths and 26% of all global infections, but we have 5% of the world's population. It took us 4 months to get to 100,000 deaths, 2 months, 3 months each to get to 200 and 300,000 deaths, and then 1 month each to get to 400 and 500. The death rate right now is steady, but it did accelerate very, very quickly. Right now, on an average globally, World Health estimates that somebody dies from COVID every 15 seconds. The variants have emerged. Every single variant that is global is in the United States, and we have created a few of our own. Right now, more than 4,000 variants have been identified. Most of them are, not all of them are sequenced, some of them are sequenced. But this is what viruses do. This is natural for virus. Virus replicates very quickly in your body. And so when it replicates incompletely, which means it's literally evolving minute by minute by minute. And so as it evolves, these variants arise. Most of them are less virulent, cause less disease, and are far less infectious, and so they die out. But those that emerge that are more infectious actually become opportunistic in terms of taking over the virus replication. And that's what's happened, particularly with the United Kingdom variant, which was the first one found. Right now, more than 20% of the variants in the United States are in Florida. And that's also increasing in New York and in California. California, New York, and Texas have raised their own variants. Those are also being exported globally. So we are also joining in the fray. There are variants that have been identified by World Health and CDC that they say of concern. New variants have been found in Scotland, Japan, France. The couple that are in the United States, they're all more contagious than the original virus. Cases in the New York variant have risen more than 12% in the last month. And the California variant makes up more than half of every county in California. The UK variant, which is B117, is way more highly infectious, about 50% more infectious. It does cause more disease, and it is 2 times more fatal, particularly in a younger population, 25 to 45. It does appear to be covered by the current mRNA vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, albeit at a slightly lower efficacy. It is now the predominant virus variant circulating in the United States. And CDC is believing that it can probably prolong the infection, making people who are infectious more infectious for a longer period of time. So it's a really nasty variant. South Africa has 2 variants. Both of those are more infectious. Only one of them appears to be more virulent. That one is covered by the vaccine. The other one that is not more virulent hasn't been thoroughly tested yet, but doesn't appear to be completely covered by the mRNA vaccines. The Brazilian variant is now in 35 states and 41 countries. The South African variant is in all 50 states. The UK variant is also in all 50 states. The Brazilian variant is partly covered by the vaccines, but not completely. And the rest of them honestly just have not been tested completely yet. Coronaviruses still mutate more slowly than a flu virus, for example. So it's a slowly mutating virus, but because it spreads so fast in general, it mutates quickly just because of how much there is around. COVID-19 is about 10 times more fatal than the flu. COVID has an overall about 1% fatality rate. The flu is about 0.1%. And it's about 50 to 100 times less fatal than things like Ebola or Zika or some of the other viruses that we've seen, but those are less infectious. But think about that, a 1% fatality rate in the US, if it hit everybody, is about 3.3 million people. We're not there yet, and I don't think we'll get there. The fatality rate is also dependent on age. It is far more fatal in the aged, 65 and older, but it is insidious again, not because of its fatality rate, but because of the long-term consequences, the sequelae that these viruses, that the coronavirus causes. So for every 1 fatality, there are 19 hospitalizations. That's one of the reasons that people are so concerned about hospital utilization and medical costs. For every 1 fatality, there are 18 people who will go on to develop permanent heart damage. In one study, 80% of those who recovered showed heart damage by MRI on an ongoing basis. For every 1 fatality, there are 10 who will develop permanent lung scarring. I've seen MRIs of young female cross-country runners, probably some of the healthiest lungs you'll ever see, and they are permanently scarred at the base. They will never get that full lung capacity back ever. For every 1 fatality, 3 will develop permanent kidney damage. For every 1 fatality, 3 will develop strokes. One of the cardinal places where this virus goes is in the small blood vessel lining cells. And so it causes a clot, and that can cause a stroke. It can cause many other sequelae as well. For every 1 fatality, there will be at least 2 permanent neurological defects. up to and including psychoses, anxiety, inability to walk. There are a number of things that have come out. For every one fatality, there are 2 significant, we don't know if they're permanent yet, but cognitive dysfunctions. And one study showed that that was a loss of 9 IQ points, which equates to about 10 years of cognitive ability. That was amazing. So there's long-term nerve damage. It has been shown, to get into the brain. It doesn't appear to affect the neurons, but it appears to affect the cells around the neurons. So the long-term nerve damage can be anything from cognition to walking to just a long-term loss of smell. That's also a central nervous system function. People younger than 21 account for about 1/4 of the population in the United States. They make up less than 1% of deaths from COVID, but 2% of children who get COVID still require hospital care. So it's a nasty one. There are not very many treatments. There are a significant number of clinical trials that are looking at different monoclonal antibodies and other mechanisms of treating the disease. Some are beginning finally to emerge, but through the pandemic, there really has been very, very little. I think the 3 things that we did find early on that would be helpful, certainly no of the normal flu treatments that we have worked for this. None of the inhibitors, neuraminidase and denuclease inhibitors worked. Convalescent plasma has not been shown to be particularly promising, but what we did find was there are 2 phases to this disease that have different treatments that do help. One was early on in the infection, you want to decrease the number of viral replications. And so you give an antiviral like remdesivir. Later in the infection, a lot of the damage that's caused is not really the virus, it's the hyperimmune response that your body mounts. This is such an infectious virus and it replicates so fast that your body's immune system tends to clomb onto it and try to hit it as hard as it can. That causes significant inflammation. And that inflammation can cause system damage as well. The virus, in addition, has been shown to get into organs like the pancreas and cause diabetes, even in someone who didn't have a predisposition for diabetes. It gets into your thyroid and your thymus and can cause metabolic issues. So it basically goes everywhere in the body. So later, to stem that hyperimmune response, an anti-inflammatory like a steroid has been proven helpful. The other thing that for those that are hospitalized is simply moving a patient from lying on his back to lying on their front, because that reduces the amount of pressure on the lungs. If you're ventilated, it reduces the amount of ventilation they have to use. So that's been very, very helpful. And there are other treatments, monoclonal antibody treatments that the FDA has now approved for emergency use that they're continuing to test. Early on in this pandemic, the native immune response, your natural immune response to this virus, was shown to be pretty weak and short-lived. The antibodies do not last very long, maybe 12 weeks at best. We don't know so much about the cellular response, but it's not a strong immune response other than the fact that you're creating this massive inflammation. And that's why the vaccines have become so important. There are currently about 13 other vaccines in various stages of testing. 3 have been approved in the United States for what's called emergency authorization. That is not a full approval, but is approval on the basis of available efficacy and safety data. And I'm going to add to that because I know there's a lot of people out there who are saying, we don't have enough safety data, I don't believe it. But we've been working particularly on the mRNA vaccines for 20 years. There have been mRNA vaccines that have been developed for Ebola that have been approved, some for Zika, some for other Marburg viruses, other things like that. They haven't all been efficacious, but they have all been shown to be safe. And that's the thing that led FDA to do this emergency authorization use. Right now, as of yesterday, when I looked, 17% of the US population have received both doses, so are fully vaccinated. About 16% have received 1 dose. And the J&J vaccine, the 1-dose vaccine, is about to be reestablished by FDA. They stopped it because they had a death, which they have to by law, but it's such a minute amount of people who get that very odd side effect that they said it's worth reestablishing that one. So it's still considered a safe vaccine. The mRNA vaccines this is the first time they've been commercialized in the US. They are very safe. I have seen all of the clinical data. I saw the original clinical protocols. They were very robustly tested, not only across gender, across age, across race. but over $40,000 for each of the two. $40,000 people for Moderna, 40,000 people for Pfizer. The mRNA that is in that vaccine codes for one of those protein spikes. And so what happens is when that vaccine is introduced into the body, the immune system recognizes that as a foreign protein and then creates a memory cell that says the next time I see it, when the virus is actually introduced, I can mount an immune response to it. And that immune response right now has been shown to last 9 months. That's the only data we have. We continue to test. And so it may last much longer than that, but that's the amount of data we have right now. The mRNA of the vaccine does not get into your cells, does not affect your human DNA, does not affect your fertility. That's a lot of urban legend out there. It is simply coding for that small protein on the outside of the virus itself. Both of the vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, are highly effective, 95% effective, and both of the companies now have begun other trials, not only against the variants, but also to make it easier and safer to transport at higher temperatures, let's say it that way, because they required extreme refrigeration early on. It takes about 2 to 4 weeks for full immunity to develop after the second dose. Pfizer is a 3-week booster. Moderna is a 4-week booster. So you need both to get to that 95% effectiveness. And if you've had COVID, they ask you just to wait 90 days to make sure your antibodies are cleared before you get the vaccine so you can avoid competing antibodies. Both the mRNA vaccines have also been tested safely in more than 20,000 pregnant women. And so even pregnant women are cleared right now for the vaccine. Pfizer has now applied to FDA for dosing of ages 12 and above. The only authorization right now is for 16 and above, but it's likely before school goes back that we will have vaccines for 12 and above. Moderna is also testing at much lower ages. Right now we have testing going on in the children's hospitals around the country of 6 months and above. So by the end of the year, it's possible we will have vaccines for the very young as well. And that's important when we get to herd immunity. There are other vaccines that are being tested for other things. The only other two that have been approved, one in the US, 2 in Europe, are J&J, the Janssen, which is the one shot, and then AstraZeneca has been approved in Europe. Both of those are basically using carrier viruses, adenovirus, that take that same protein spike DNA and attach it to a virus that doesn't cause disease, but it still gets into the body. That's one of the reasons that they're looking at those adenovirus carriers are also somewhat new, and that's why they're looking so carefully at reports of blood clots. But the J&J is likely to be reapproved by FDA very quickly. Vaccine rollout in general is slower than anticipated, but it's getting better. Production has started to catch up. It is likely that we will need boosters, not only for the variants, but probably also on an annual basis, at least for a while. World Health has declared this to be an endemic virus, which means that it's not going to go away. It's something we're going to live with. And epidemiologists really are looking to create enough immunity that 85% of the global population has received a vaccine and receives repeated vaccines, and then only the young potentially are not vaccinated because they generally, 99% of them experience this as a mild cold. And so it will be circulating in the population in that small part of the population. I think it needs to be said, although it should be not need to be said, is that having the vaccine isn't enough. You have to be vaccinated. If we don't get to herd immunity, we're going to be continuing to see these variants at an increasing rate, and we're going to have a much higher level of COVID around for a long period of time. The vaccine is not a magic cape. As soon as you get it, you're not completely not able to infect other people. Although studies are emerging that says that's better than we anticipated, but 95% efficacy is a statistical efficacy. It's a population statistic. So basically, break it down, it means that there's a possibility that 1 in 20 people who receives the vaccine is not completely covered. So 19 out of 20 people are effectively covered, but 1 in 20 possibly is not. And that means that even if you've gotten the vaccine, you can still get a variant, you can still get infected, and you can still infect other people. So if you've been vaccinated, CDC's recommendation right now is still to wear a mask, still for adults, stay socially distanced by at least 6 feet. We'll talk about singers in a minute. Children have been reduced to 3 feet, But children are reduced to 3 feet only because they don't experience symptoms and they don't experience the disease. They may be carriers, but they don't really get sick. So children can be reduced to 3 feet. Adults are still recommended at 6 feet. CDC is still recommending that large gatherings be avoided. If you've been fully vaccinated, 2 weeks past your second dose, and you're with a family unit where everyone else is also fully vaccinated, less than 8 to 10 people, you can probably be indoors without masks. Anybody else, any more than that, anyone who's not family, CDC is still recommending masked. And that's for the foreseeable future. Herd immunity, as I said, is about 70 to 90% of the entire population vaccinated. Remember, I said we don't even have vaccines for about 20% of our population yet. So even if every adult currently got vaccinated, we're only at about 70 to 80%, and we're not quite there yet. So it's going to be important for us to get vaccines for the children. So what does this mean for church? And actually, I want to say globally, only 12% of adults are vaccinated. The UK and some of the 1 or 2 of the other European countries are about where the US is, about 41%, at least 1 dose, 26% fully vaccinated. That's the update to the numbers I gave you before. But globally, the vaccine rollout has been, in some countries, abysmal, and it's actually quite sad. The PMA just put out an article on that. So what does it mean for your churches? There's a couple of things. I mean, obviously, people should still be masked if you're indoors. They should be distanced by at least 6 feet. We generally recommend a couple of different things that are somewhat controversial because nobody wants to do them, but it's still important. Limit people who are passing things around. It's not so much the touch as the people who are passing things that can be touched. So things like collection plates, communion should all be left at the back of the sanctuary. Let people pick up their own. Limit the amount of air that is blowing around a sanctuary, because air that is blowing over an infected person blows around that infection. And I know people have said, I've got UV filters, I've got HEPA filters, I've got this great system. That's great for about the first 30 seconds that air leaves that system. It's clean, but as soon as that air blows over someone who's infected and shedding virus, that air is no longer clean. And there was a study that came out of Guangzhou right after the virus emerged in China back in late 2019 that the CDC published. And it's a perfect metaphor for a mid-sized sanctuary that's closed. At least most of the sanctuaries in my presbytery don't have windows that can open. So it was a restaurant with an air conditioner blowing air, no open ventilation. One person was infectious, and they could actually track all of the people all the way around that one person who then got infected. And so that's why we say, if you've got to air condition, if you've got to heat, pre-air condition the sanctuary, and then turn off the blowers while people are in there, and then you can turn them back on when people leave. But don't have blowing air around while people are sitting there, because you just don't know if someone might be asymptomatic but still infectious. The other one is, of course, and this one's emotional, singing. Originally, we said no singing, no choirs. And I think the best guidance is still no choirs, because people who are close to each other and inhaling large amounts of airs and then expelling it in a song. I have videos that I'll send to Larissa afterwards that show a singer will project aerosol for 18 to 24 feet. So there are some circulating guidances. One of the best ones I saw from Minnesota said, if you've got singers, a duet, a trio, a couple of singers, if they're distanced from each other and from the congregation by at least 16 feet, you're probably okay. Masks have been developed that allow singers to have enough airspace in front of them that they're not sucking in the air when they sing. But full out choirs, volunteer choirs, are probably not a great idea now. Can you sing hymns in the sanctuary if everyone's masked? Probably. I think that can be done safely. How do you decide whether you're open or not? My guidance is pick one credible source and stick with it, because each source represents different cuts at data that are reported at different times. And if you're trying to sort of triangulate them, you drive yourself crazy. One of the best ones for New Jersey is a website called covidactnow.org. It goes county by county, and it's made up of 5 different medical and hospital utilization objective data points that can tell you where you are in the spread of the disease, the infectivity rate, and hospital bed utilization. So how many hospital beds are available should you hit a spike? You have to be careful. If you're in a rural area with few beds, you're going to hit that spike really fast. If you're in an urban area, like a lot of your churches are, you probably have more hospital beds available to you. So that is a great amalgam kind of data that you can use to determine whether or not you feel it's safe for your sanctuary to open or not. Right now, in my presbytery, up until about middle of March, I think I had maybe 10 out of 67 that were back in the sanctuary. They were also doing hybrid. Right now, I probably have, I want to say 55 out of the 67 that are edging back in around the Easter time. And they're doing quite well because they're doing all the right things. The other piece is, if you have a big congregation but a smaller sanctuary, think about pre-registering people so you know you don't have people walking in that it's going to overwork your capacity to distance at 6 feet. What else? I think I've rambled on long enough. Is there, let's open it up for questions. Let's see, got some on chat. Statistic that 1 in 8 and 1 in 5 in New Jersey. I have that from, I think that's from CDC, but I can send the link. Yeah, the proportion of people who have been infected, 1 in 10 right now in the US overall, moving toward 1 in 8. It's 1 in 5 in New York City and probably that metropolitan area. If an elderly person, yes, if an elderly person was successfully treated for COVID-19 with monoclonal antibodies, you should talk to your doctor. But yes, I would still recommend getting the vaccine. The vaccine will protect you for longer. And actually, if you've had COVID, you've heard about the long haul symptoms that last and last and last, particularly fatigue and a lot of other symptoms. There is anecdotal data. I've not seen a study on it, but there's anecdotal data to say in some people, the vaccine has actually helped with those long haul symptoms. So the vaccine can also be seen a little bit as a treatment in a way, but you should talk to your doctor, always talk to your doctor, but yes, you should still consider getting the vaccine. And yeah, covidactnow.org, thank you, that's it. Anything else, Cynthia?
I just heard a woman today on the radio. I was floored, but she's a scientist. And she was telling everyone not to get the vaccine. I'm already vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And she was saying, and I can't remember it all, but she was talking about the vaccine and how the vaccine is actually going to cause problems in people long term. And they're hiding all that information from us. And so she said, it will be very interesting to chart what happens after all these vaccinations have happened. And is there going to be more cancer? Is there going to be more heart? Is there going to be more, all these issues? And I'm sitting there thinking, she literally came out and said, do not get vaccinated and do not wear masks because of the, I don't know the science stuff, but something about breathing in and it's really going to cause you more problems. And I'm thinking, for people who listen to that, I mean, I couldn't wait to get that shot in my arm. Yeah. And I thought, she doesn't believe, she believes that Fauci is telling what it's a political thing now and it's a money thing. And I'm thinking, how do we really know? I mean, I've already heard you twice in various different places.
That's scary.
No, it's helpful. How do we know who to tell people in our church, our families to listen to? When I heard this woman, and then I'm sitting there going, okay, I had breast cancer. Am I going to get more breast cancer? I mean, it was so different. And of course, the person that brought her on thinks this thing's a joke. So I don't know where he found her, but I mean, she had credentials, but that's what she's telling people. And people in the churches, they just want to go back. And so how do you help people to understand what is the fact and what isn't? And
yeah, I mean, it's tough. And there are people out there who that frankly makes me really angry, because I think that is unconscionable to give that kind of advice. I've seen the data on this. I've spent, like I said, Larissa introduced it as I've spent 36 years in the pharmaceutical
No.
industry, working with viruses, working with vaccines, working with all kinds of medicines, working with FDA. I've been with boards of health on 5 continents. This is not something that's taken lightly. This is not something that is just cavalierly going, oh, let's try this and put it in the arms of human guinea pigs. This is hugely and importantly, correctly tested in tens of thousands of people. Ideally, would we like 10 years of data on this? Of course, but we're in the middle of a pandemic that's now killed more than 3 million people globally. That's not the time to be shy. It's also not the time to be cavalier, and that's not at all what I'm saying. However, the data are quite convincing that this is safe, this is effective, it's stopping the pandemic in its tracks where people are getting vaccinated. And so I'm going to give you another statistic on masks, and I will in the links that I send Larissa after this, one of those is to show you how effective one of those paper surgical masks is. In a normal year, we hospitalize about 60,000 people with flu, just basic flu. This year, we hospitalized across the United States, at last count, 115 people. Now, you can say that's because the flu virus didn't show up, which has never happened in the history of mankind. Or you can say, guess what? Everybody was masked. And so that statistic alone tells me that as a human species, we know how to intervene in something like a global pandemic with the consequences that COVID-19 has shown us. How do you answer people? I just shake my head. I will tell you, I spoke with a parishioner the other day who was of that same ilk. I'm not getting the vaccine. I don't think it's safe. I don't wear masks. Nothing I can say about that. And thank God she's never been infected. So, let's pray that that continues. But you're not going to convince certain people that the vaccines are safe or that masks are good or that COVID is even a thing. So,
well, you said something about that MNR, what's the
mRNA?
Yeah, and she made reference to that and said the reason we've never used it is because of the damage it will do to.
The mRNA does not get into the cell and it's not a genetic modification of your body. It simply primes the immune system to recognize that mRNA again when the virus comes in and then neutralize it. That's exactly what the vaccine does. The only reason it's not been commercialized, there are 2 reasons it hasn't been commercialized. It actually is approved in certain countries for Ebola. So it has been commercialized before, but it has not proven to be an effective vaccine for some of the other viruses that they've used that platform for. So from an efficacy standpoint, you don't want to just jab people in the arms if it's not going to do anything. That's the reason it hasn't ever been commercialized. So when this one came out at 95% for both mRNA vaccines, because we had genetically sequenced this virus a year ago, that was a major win. And it's the first time we've really been able to show that. Now they're looking at the mRNA platform for all kinds of things, including HIV, which has never really had an effective vaccine. And that's a virus, that is one of the viruses that I worked with before it was called HIV. It was HTLV3 and 4. So that one I'm familiar with. So we'll see.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Lisa,
So let's see what else is in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a question, is it safe to seat people in our wraparound balcony? And then I saw Robin Reeves with her hand up. So maybe we could do that balcony question first, go to Robin, and then there's a few others underneath there in the chat too.
Okay, I don't know what a wraparound balcony is, David. You're going to have to describe that one for me.
It's just,
right.
Okay, you want to describe the
Go ahead.
Go ahead, we want you to describe the balcony.
Oh, okay, I just stepped out and returned. It's just a balcony that goes across the back of the sanctuary and along the sides.
Okay.
And then there's a lower seating area that's the main area.
So yeah, as long as all the same guidances are in place, that they're still 6 feet distanced, and yeah, I mean, they're far enough up and they're far enough away from each other, that should be fine. The church I consider my home church in Cincinnati has the same arrangement. It's fine, not a problem.
Good to hear. Okay.
Good.
I think I saw Robin with her hand up, and then there's a few in the chat.
Yeah, Robin.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up on various theories by people you may hear that believe in masking, not masking, etc. I certainly do believe in the vaccine and the masks and the 6 feet. I read yesterday that of the new cases getting developed daily in the United States, 75% of them are coming from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida.
Right.
And I just wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, you look at New York and New Jersey with really fairly severe shutdowns and restrictions and still in place. And Florida, that's just, had their schools open since last summer, many less restrictions. And I wonder what your thoughts are as to what could be the explanation for that? Why are the states?
It's a really good question, and I don't have the answer. So I would say, knowing New York and New Jersey and the concentration of people there, that would have been my first guess, that you can mask a distance, but there are just so many people. And then everybody left New York City. One of my best friends has sort of been stuck there. And she said, it's emptied out. I don't have a good answer for that. Florida and Texas, I think, relaxed restrictions way too fast. Michigan, for me, is one of the outliers. Other than Detroit and maybe Traverse City and a couple of other places like Ann Arbor, Michigan is not a densely populated state. And yet they seem to have more cases per capita than I would have predicted. I actually would have said Ohio would have been worse because we have so many large cities in strategic areas, but Ohio's done very well. And our governor did us a lot of favors by putting restrictions in place and publishing data constantly. So I don't have a good answer for that. It's not just variants. I think the most recent spikes in New York and New Jersey are definitely variants. So I think that's part of it. I think Florida is just, they had people on the beaches who didn't have any masks and probably were infectious. Florida also has both ends of the population that one spreads the virus, the younger, and then the elderly that are more at risk to get it. And so I think that combination had a factor as well. I throw up my hands at Michigan. I can't explain them. Can't explain them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So Larissa, you got an email question, says, for churches experimenting with in-person indoor worship, what do you advise about benchmarks for whether to return online only or outdoor only? And that's a really good question. Larissa, I can send you sort of a decision tree that's based on the COVID Act now color coding. And I think so for us in Ohio, our governor had his own color coding, and it was 7 of those independent, scientific, epidemiologic, hospital utilization kinds of metrics. And so the guidance I gave my churches is if you are, the colors are different, purple or red, the high end, you should be closed. You should not have in-person services. If you're orange or yellow, you can consider it, but make sure you understand what the restrictions are. Are you going to pre-register? Are you going to require masks? Are you going to distance? The key there is that, so I'll go back to the question in a second. It's session's decision on building utilization. It's not the pastor's. So if session decides to go back in, they have to set the criteria that need to be true to have in-person worship. And if do they require masks? Do they require masks beyond at all times while in the sanctuary? They have to measure out 6 feet. They have to figure out how to do collections and communion. And is there going to be singing? And what is that going to look like? And then when session makes that decision, it has to be them that polices it. The pastor can't stand at the door and say, I'm sorry, you don't have a mask, you can't come in. That has to be session. And so that expectation, when it's articulated that way, puts session in the hot seat a little bit about how much liability and responsibility are you willing to take to bring people back into the sanctuary. One of the things we didn't talk about was, while I said limit circulating air, fresh ventilation, if you can open doors and open windows, that clears the air on a constant basis, is a really good thing. And so that's a way to sort of allow in-person worship with all of those other guidances in place. I've seen the Wisconsin Council of Churches recommendation that says if your local area has more than 10 per 100,000 new cases, you should stay closed. I don't think that's a bad guidance, but I think if you're careful with vaccinations, if you really have people masked, if you really have people distanced, and you're smart, I think you can start to edge back to in-person worship. But I'll give you another quick, here's my little soapbox, if you will. And I learned this from personal experience. Churches are starting to go back to hybrid. I mean, we've been in this liminal space of no man's land for a year now. Churches have learned to do hybrid. They've learned that it actually can bring new worshipers into their church that wouldn't necessarily cross their threshold. And how do we continue to deal with that? And so there's a couple of recognitions with that. One, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with members that aren't present. How do we deal with online membership? And what does that mean? And how does participation attract that? And do we have online deacons? But the real big one for us, and it was a huge realization, was when you start to go back to hybrid, when you've got people in the sanctuary and you've got virtual, you've got to really make sure that your service, your worship service, is created for the people online, not for the people in the pews. Because if you make the people online feel like the kids that got sent to the bed while the party's still going on downstairs, you're going to lose them. And so you really have to concentrate on them. That means really think about and watch your online worship. What's the camera angle like? Are you looking down at the top of the head of the pastor, or are you engaged with the person online? Are you doing a lot of recitation reading, like corporate reading, that comes across as mumbles online, where the people who are sitting at home are going, I don't even know what they're saying, and I'm uncomfortable saying it along with them. Hymns that are sung in the sanctuary are also mumbled for the most part. A soloist might be highlighted, but when the corporate congregation sings, it's really sort of awkward online. And so look at it from both standpoints, because as a pastor, it's really easy to stand in front of a congregation and respond to them and sort of forget that you've got that other cadre of people up there who also need Jesus, and you're to witness to them as well. So think about how you go back and do both of those kinds of things. But I do think, I know New Jersey is high, but I do think if you've got a big sanctuary and you pre-register a small number of people, and you maybe even rotate them so you get people through in multiple services over several weeks, I think you can start to get back into the sanctuary. I think I've mentioned the ventilation thing. Fresh air is much better because it takes the virus out. It still pushes the virus, but it only pushes it in one direction. It doesn't make it circulate. So it's much, much better. And again, social distancing and mask. No choirs yet. Congregation, the reason I say no choirs is the choir is generally not distanced. I mean, if you think about what a normal choir is, they're sort of bunched together. If you've got a small choir of 5 or 6 people and you can keep them distanced, and of course we're Presbyterian, so nobody sits in the front row, right? So you can be distanced from the congregation. You can do a couple of trio or a quartet or something like that. But when the congregation is singing, they're masked and they're staying with their family unit and they're distanced from other people. And so that mask actually prevents a lot of that transmission. Laura, does that help? I hope. Food.
Yes, thank you for that.
Okay,
that
good.
does clarify it.
Okay.
Because
good.
that is very much the debate that's going on in my congregation. There, an uprising from the session. We're just going to bring everything back because we're tired of this.
Yeah.
And we're going to sing in everything back. And yeah. I needed to know that specifically. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I have no authority, just so you're aware.
Yeah, neither do I.
Yeah, really. Food in general is another emotional part, because I think the other thing that people are missing besides corporate worship is corporate fellowship. And food requires that you take your mask off. Food requires that you get closer than 6 feet. So food for fellowship is probably not a great idea. If you can do it in a way that is either prepackaged, where family groups can gather but stay distanced, and you're outdoors, that's probably okay. But anything that's indoors where people are interacting at a closer distance and they're unmasked because they're eating, even if they take it on and off, it's not a great thing to do. Communion, I think, is fine. Communion is a quick unmask and mask back on, as long as that's what they're doing. And that's, I think that has worked in the churches that I've seen. Outside is better than inside if you can do it. I don't know about you guys, but we're having a cicada infestation in mid-May through June. None of my churches are going to be outside for that period of time. I can guarantee it. It's just too yucky. So outdoors is better than indoors. Brass ensembles, David, that's a really interesting question. Everything I've seen from the national associations of musicians, both at a high school level, the collegiate level, and at an ecumenical level, have said anything that blows air is a really bad idea. You can't do a brass with a mask on. You can sing with a mask on, but you can't do a brass instrument with a mask on. So this is the heyday of the cellos and the violins, I think. I would avoid anything, any woodwind, any brass instrument at all. Let's see. Yeah, I will, Lisa, I will share all of my documents so you guys can use them at will, adapt them at will. There's nothing here that's proprietary. I have read studies about the interaction of rhinovirus and COVID. It's an interesting study. It's very preliminary. For those of you who may not have read it, that there is actually a suppression of COVID infection if rhinovirus is also present, which indicates that, first of all, it might not be rhinovirus, it might be another coronavirus, which means those coronavirus antibodies are there. And I couldn't really tell from the paper I read, but rhinovirus is another of the viruses that I've worked with, and it is an activator of the immune system. And so what it does is it heightens your immune response to start, and that means that you're clearing a lot of other things out of your body. If you've ever noticed that most of the time when you get a cold, you don't get anything else, and that's probably why. But I don't think it's a definitive answer right now. The same is true for things like vitamin D. There's a lot of supplements out there. If you take this, you're going to get less symptoms or you won't get infected. None of that's really proven. See what else. Yeah. Speaker wears an extra mic that connects to the computer. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. If there's any way for you to zoom in on the pastor or the liturgist or the soloist, so that you're changing the view, just like for someone who's sitting in the sanctuary, their view changes. That also helps very much with a live stream kind of thing. It drives you nuts when speakers don't wear a mask. It's interesting. Most of the places that I've preached during the pandemic, for those places that have been open, I've been able to get at least 20 feet away from the congregation. And because so many of our congregants are older, a lot of them do need to lip read a little bit. I think one of the things that some of our pastors have done have gotten those clear lucite shields so that when they preach, they can be seen. And it doesn't quite mumble the voice as much. It's not a substitute for a mask because you can still breathe the air in underneath that lucite shield, but at least it's a barrier. What it's really for is if somebody's going to spit on you. And frankly, if somebody's going to spit on you, I'd say you probably need a new job. That's not a happy thing. But that's another potential, that you could wear the lucite shield to speak in public and then put the mask back on when you're done speaking. And yeah, so we've told clergy leaders that if you're properly distanced, if you're at least 15 feet away, you can take the mask off while you're doing your sermon, while you're reading a piece of scripture, but then put it back down just for extra safety when you're sitting down, when other things are going on. Yes, there are studies about infertility or youth if they're taking the vaccine. That's been proven to be false. There is no effect that has been shown on fertility. I have a niece who is now 6 months pregnant and another niece who just got married, and you can be very, very sure that I looked that up. And so there is absolutely no indication that these vaccines cause infertility.
So you don't worry about teenagers getting it and not being able to have children later or whatever?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Correct.
Lisa, could you talk a little bit about kind of work requirements around vaccines for participation, or asking people about that in regards to attending things? I feel like I've gotten some questions about that too, and would be curious your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, we're not medical workers, so officially HIPAA doesn't apply to us. However, asking anybody about a medical condition is really not sort of a kosher thing. I think for me, like I said, the vaccine is not a magic cape. So at this point, those who are vaccinated are asked to do the same things as those who are unvaccinated. Still need to wear masks. You still need to stay socially distanced. You still need to wash your hands as much as you can. You still need to, do all the things we've talked about for being in a sanctuary. So it's not like those who are fully vaccinated can come in and have a party. The CDC official guidance still says large gatherings, even of vaccinated people, are to be avoided because we don't know all of the variants and how they're interacting with the vaccine. We don't know how the reinfection rate looks. And we're getting data that says a vaccinated individual actually does shed less virus, but you can still be infectious. So that's the scientific part of it. For me, the other is almost theological. I mean, Jesus didn't exclude anybody. Why would we? And my guess is for a lot of our congregations, there's still a cadre of people who, even if they are vaccinated, are just not comfortable coming out in public yet. And so I don't know that that's actually a valid metric for who might want to come into the sanctuary. Certainly you can mandate and should be mandating that anyone who's been exposed, just like when you walk into a grocery store or a Walgreens, if you've been exposed, if you have a fever, if you have any symptoms, you should be quarantined. And so that is an exclusion for coming into the sanctuary.
Thank you. I'm just toggling through to see if there's anybody else with any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself.
I just have another comment. Lisa, you wrote this article. I don't know if it was in Presbyterian Outlook or not, that I read about the future of the church and what you started to say earlier about making sure you include people and thinking through, the hybrid. It was an excellent article. I think you should post that. And I can't remember, where did I read that? The Outlook?
I think it was I don't know where I read it either. So I've written a blog. Yeah, that was honestly just supposed to be for our weekly newsletter, and it got picked up and sort of circulated beyond just the presbytery. There's a couple of things out there, and there's one in one of the PMA publications. There's one in Outlook. The Presbytery News Cycles has sent a couple through. I don't always write them. Somebody else writes them and says, "Is this okay?" So I'm not sure where to get the one that you're referring to.
It was really good for churches to think about, like you said, Jesus included everybody, and how do we begin to think differently in the church today? And if you know which article it is, I would post it.
I appreciate that. If I can think of which one it was, I'll send it on to Larissa. I do know that the blog I wrote for this week. So if you really want to start to annoy people, although I've gotten a lot of good feedback on this one, is entitled "You Are Not a Family." Because particularly as I've engaged with my smaller churches, I have churches that are big urban, big suburban churches, but I also have churches that go all the way to the edge of Appalachia in Ohio, down into the mid part of Kentucky and into southeastern Indiana. So I've got little tiny rural churches that are hugely historic. And every time I talk to them, and they do the same gesture, but we're family. And I keep saying, you're not. When was the last time you invited a stranger into your family? And if that family feeling that you hold your heart in is your comfort zone, then you're not doing what Jesus asked you to do, which was in order, love God, love people, make disciples. It means you've congregated yourself in the church and you're not going outside and bringing others in. And so that's raised a little bit of a ruckus, but I've never been known to be shy. So.
Lisa, I see there's one more question in the chat. Is there any advantage to asking attendees if they're willing to tell us if they're vaccinated?
Not really. I mean, again, you're going to ask those attendees to do the same thing as the unvaccinated people for protection on both sides. And I don't, depends on how much trust I think there is between the person who's asking and the congregation. Some people might be willing to say that just so you know, but it doesn't really change anything that you're going to do. Nothing is going to, I will tell you, in Ohio, our governor has said he will not lift mask requirements until we get to 50 out of 100,000 infection rate. Right now, we're about at 200 per 100,000. So we're about 4 times higher than that. And so my personal advice is vaccination is great. And when we get to herd immunity and CDC starts to reduce the restrictions or the requirements, I think that's a great symbol. I also think that looking at your local government and following your local government mandates is important, because I think that consistency will drive a consistent message and maybe start to address some of the things that Cynthia was talking about, where you've got these little nuggets of antidotes out there that are saying it's all false. Well, they say the same thing about racism, and I'm not sure that's true either. So, you know, it's one of those things, if you haven't experienced it, or if you're gaining by saying it's not there, then you're going to say that. But I can tell you firsthand, I've had lots of COVID funerals in the Presbytery of Cincinnati. We've had a lot of people who are long haulers. This is not a virus you want to mess with. This is not fake. And the vaccinations will significantly help. So if the majority of the congregation is fully vaccinated, again, yes, and the congregation isn't the only place they meet. So it's not like you're in a bubble. I mean, all of those 95% of your congregation are also going to the grocery store and the gas station and the pharmacy, and those people may not all be vaccinated. So you still don't know who's been exposed to what and what they might be carrying. And so the vaccination is a start, but it's not a bubble. Again, so let me amend that answer. If, for example, you have a Bible study of 10 people and they're all fully vaccinated, under CDC guidance, those people could meet unmasked. But to bring an entire congregation together is still not within CDC guidance anyway. And so I know Cynthia brought up Tony Fauci. I will tell you, Tony Fauci is one of the smartest men I have ever met. He has absolutely no guile in him whatsoever and no agenda. All he wants to do is put science out. So anybody who impugns Tony Fauci is on my bad person list, because he's amazing. And he is about as apolitical as you can get. So there's my defense of Tony Fauci.
What you were just saying, Lisa, makes me think too, like, for example, my husband and I are vaccinated, but we have children who aren't vaccinated, right? So when we're in spaces, it's not just us that are living in our household, but also those children as well. So that just, you know, when we think about, as we were talking about bubbles in the beginning. So
yeah, exactly.
I'm really grateful for your time, Lisa, for you getting to visit us virtually in New Jersey / New York City and all the different corners that have joined with us. But, you know, next time you're actually here in the state, we'll have to do a little tour of all the good food.
I would love that. And you can be sure that when I come to New Jersey, Larissa, I'm calling you, definitely.
Yes. Well, and we'll post this video as well as all the resources that Lisa talked about on our website as soon as we can. And thank you all for coming. I want to close our time in prayer. So let's pray. Holy and gracious God, it is always a privilege to gather here among your people. And today we especially give thanks for Lisa, for the gifts and skills that she brings to her ministry and to her presbytery. And so we ask that you continue to be with her as she supports and encourages others. Be with us all as we leave this virtual gathering space, that we may go changed and renewed and nourished for what may be ahead. We pray all of this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Larissa, thank you for having me. You guys be blessed.